On behalf of the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health, I welcome each of you to today's webinar, Indigenous Peoples' Perspectives on Climate Change and Water Safety and Security. My name is Roberta Stout, and I'm a research associate with the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health. Our center is located at the University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George, BC, the traditional territory of the Tsidet'ina First Nation. I will be co-facilitating today's webinar with my colleague, Donna Atkinson. Very briefly, the NCCIH is one of 6 national collaborating centers for public health that was established in 2005, with funding from the Public Health Agency of Canada. Our sister NCCs are focused on specific topic areas, including infectious diseases, environmental health, healthy public policy, determinants of health, and methods and tools for knowledge translation. Our center supports health equity for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples by promoting the use of Indigenous-informed evidence to transform practice, policy, and program decision-making across all sectors of public health. All questions for panelists, as well as any technical questions that you may have, can be submitted in the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. Links to resources mentioned by speakers will be posted in the chat window. You will have access to live transcription, where you'll find the bottom at the bottom of your screen a button for that to be enabled. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the NCCIH website. Just so you're aware, there may be some brief pauses as we transition between each of the presenters, as well a note that Dr. Leonard, our first speaker, will not be available during the Q&A session of this webinar. Today's webinar sets out to recognize the interconnectedness between the health of waters and associated ecosystems and the health and well-being of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. To understand how climate change is impacting water safety, security, and practices for Indigenous communities. To recognize Indigenous knowledge systems and their application to water and environmental governance within the context of climate change, as well to gain knowledge on community-based adaptation tools and technology to monitor water safety within the context of climate change. We are very privileged today to have 4 speakers with us. What I'm going to do is introduce each of them before they speak, and then we will introduce the next speaker. So the first speaker is Dr. Kelsey Leonard. She is a water scientist, legal scholar, policy expert, writer, and enrolled citizen of the Shinnecock Nation located in the state of New York. Dr. Leonard is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo, where her research focuses on Indigenous water justice and its climatic, territorial, and governance underpinnings. Dr. Leonard seeks to establish Indigenous traditions of water conservation as a foundation for international water policy making. Her recent scholarship explores legal personhood for water. Welcome, Dr. Leonard.
Kabutni, thank you. It's so great to be joining all of you today in this virtual conversation. So bear with me as I load my slides for us, and then we'll get started. So I think everyone should now be seeing my slides. Also just want to make sure I've got the chat going. There we go. So it's so great to be here. As mentioned in my introduction, I'm Dr. Kelsey Leonard. I'm a citizen of the Shinnecock Nation, and much of what I will be presenting to you today is also connected to my home community, being a coastal tribal nation, First Nation, located on the eastern end of what is currently known as Long Island, New York. So as was mentioned, I unfortunately do have to leave a bit early, so I won't be able to engage in the Q&A, but if you do do have further questions, you can engage with me on Twitter. My handle is @KelseyT.Leonard, or you're welcome to also email me. I'll make sure that my email address is available for you to be able to send me any additional questions you might have. So when we're thinking about climate change, it is a direct threat to water security for Indigenous nations and communities all around the world. We've had the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC report, come out recently. We've had in this fall sort of a notification from the IPCC that we are in a code red, raising the alarm of our current and future climate crisis and calling upon all of us to act. But there are particular ways in which climate change has distinct impacts on health. And so we're actually looking through the ways in which climate change will have expected increases of health risks for Indigenous peoples and as connected to our water quality concerns, such as an increase in contamination or the proliferation of contamination, as well as the potential for the reduction of availability of water, particularly during extreme climate events like floods and droughts and other extreme climate emergencies. So what does this mean in practice? Well, across Turtle Island, North America, we see that Indigenous nations and communities, although diverse, we share many of the same characteristics that affect our ability to prepare, respond to, and cope with the impacts of climate change, in large part because of the colonial structures, settler structures that we have to coexist within, particularly in the context of water and the water regimes and water governance that really challenge our opportunities for innovation and for autonomy in water decision making. And so these challenges can be exacerbated based on our geography. So those of our communities that are located in very rural areas, our northern fly-in communities, etc. These places that are also very directly impacted right now by climate change. So we think about instances, as well as we'll talk about later today, of how this directly impacts communities along our coast. We also, as Indigenous peoples, rely on our environment. We are connected to our environment. We are part of the environment, and we have maintained that connection in comparison to some other communities around the world, where our reliance is also connected to our food systems, to our cultural practices, to our economic and cultural development and perpetuity. And we also are dealing with already existing higher levels of health risks. So in comparison to other groups, so you may think about our higher levels of diabetes, our higher levels of blood pressure and heart disease. Those are already existing health risks that will be further compounded by climate change. And then we add in the water component. We think about the ways in which we already face inadequate access to water infrastructure, or we're faced with aging infrastructure. And that can be complicated by the surrounding settler communities and their approaches to industry, to agriculture, and other forms of contamination that threaten waters globally. And so we then also look at the ways in which layered compound stressors we have as communities. We often have limited access to capital, to economic resources to be able to change and mitigate and adapt to these additional climate stressors. And sometimes that also is linked to our limited access to sufficient healthcare services. And no more has this been more pronounced than in this past few years of this pandemic. We have been critically made aware of the inequities that persist for our communities and for Indigenous peoples around the world. And so this pandemic has almost been a window into what the future of our climate crisis looks like as we continue to see these increased risks to water security and risks to Indigenous health. So the risks to health can manifest across medical and physical health, so changes in our fitness and activity levels, our health-related illnesses, our allergies, as exacerbated by climate stressors like drought, extreme precipitation events, floods, wildfires, tornadoes, etc. But it also can have real impacts for our mental health, our connections and understandings of our stress levels, our anxiety, our depression, substance abuse, different types of post-traumatic stress disorder can be exacerbated due to climate stressors. And then also community health, because we as Indigenous peoples are not just individuals, we are parts of a collective, parts of communities and nations. And so we are also very concerned with our collective health. And so when we think about what are these threats to human health, it includes extreme weather, warmer temperatures, degradation of air quality, degradation of water quality, sea level rise, increase in waterborne diseases, as well as increase in vector-borne diseases, which have a connection to water as well when you think about mosquito populations and their proliferation. But today, I want to focus in on sea level rise because that's all we have time for. And being from a coastal First Nation, we have really distinct challenges to our water security given increasing SLR or sea level rise threats. And so what do these threats look like? Well, it can be the increases in flooding, it can be the permanent inundation or the consumption by water of lands that we usually would use for livable purposes. It can be wetland loss or migration, which we know that wetlands and salt marshes and these beautiful ecosystems are the blue carbon superpowers that we need to be able to also tackle our climate crisis, maintain biodiversity. So their loss or migration is of great concern. And we also have issues around saltwater intrusion, cultural resource loss, displacement. But again, thinking about all of these in the time that we have today, I want to narrow in and talk about threats to drinking water contamination for Indigenous peoples due to sea level rise. And so these can look like increasing water stress on our infrastructure. Many of our communities rely on septic or cesspool systems, ground systems that contain our wastewater and then are pumped and pumped out on a regular basis through a truck delivery system or otherwise. Some of our communities also rely on groundwater wells, so wells to maintain our drinking water. Those types of ground systems are very susceptible to inundation, to sea level rise, and to saltwater intrusion. Luckily and thankfully, we are having babies and our families are growing and our populations are growing. But with sea level rise and the inundation or loss of lands to encroaching water, where do those populations go? How do we ensure that we have livable spaces for our nations to thrive upon? And then we also face the instances of stress around flooding and storm surge, and again, the impacts to inundation of wastewater systems and how that can lead to greater contamination of ecosystems in surrounding areas. And we also saw new data coming out through the national climate change reports, the Canada in a Changing Climate Regional Perspectives report that focused in on the Atlantic provinces. And they also note that in the Atlantic region, similar to where I come from, but on the other side of the imagined border, that the Atlantic provinces are going to experience the largest local sea level rise in Canada. And on the right-hand side, you can see here projections of modeling of if we have a high level of rise, about 2.5 meters of sea level rise, inclusive of a storm surge or flood, the Pictou-Landu First Nation pictured here could face direct impacts on their water infrastructure and wastewater infrastructure assets. And so what do we do? Well, generally, when we're thinking about these sea level rise threats, we look to sea level rise adaptation frameworks. The IPCC has put out general frameworks, so have national governments and different types of environmental NGOs and others working in this space over the years. But you might notice something a bit strange about this report and about this particular framework. It's very generic. And I use that term because that's actually what it says in the IPCC report, the generic sea level rise adaptation framework. And when we were looking at this through my lab, we noted that there was a lot of militarized and combative language. It was an approach to the environment and to climatic change that made it seem like we were in this adversarial, warlike relationship. And perhaps it doesn't need to be that way. There also weren't cultural connections, indigenous design. It was very human-centric. So when you have an adaptation framework, you usually will adopt it and share it with your community members and ask them to make these types of changes. But if they don't see themselves reflected in the adaptation framework, they're not likely to make the changes that are necessary to adapt. So our lab put together a theoretical perspective on what could new adaptation strategies look like if we made them localized, context specific, and embedded with Indigenous design and thought. And so we came out with the Wampum adaptation framework. It's really directed at Eastern coastal tribal nations along the Atlantic. It's open access and free. I'm putting a few resources into the chat now for everyone to be able to access at a later point in time, but you can download it there. But what did we come up with? Well, in comparison to the generic IPCC report, we actually said, we can maybe lead with Indigenous knowledge, our Indigenous science, our Indigenous thought in this process. And so Wampum, for many of you, you may know it as foundational to many of the treaty agreements across what is now known as Canada, particularly in the Great Lakes. Our treaty belts are made of wampum. But wampum is actually harvested and carved out of mollusk relatives, quahog and whelk shells, that are born and exist within beautiful ecosystems along the Atlantic coast. And so it's very foundational to our cultural understandings of being shore protectors, of being coastal peoples. And so we built off of that knowledge and we created the framework, which is an acronym that stands for Witness, Acknowledge, Mend, Protect, Unite, and Move. And if you read the paper, you'll get to see actual examples. The paper is not necessarily innovative or revolutionary in creating new strategies. It actually says what strategies are tribal nations and First Nations already deploying across our communities that others could learn from in how they adapt to sea level rise. And so if you read the paper, you'll see some of those examples, although I won't be able to go into much detail in that regard today. So the first principle, witness, stands for witness warnings from human and non-human relations and follow the patterns of the natural world. It's almost like thinking about biomimicry, the way in which nature is already doing wonderful things to adapt to our changing climate, and perhaps we could learn and observe to better adapt as human beings. The next principle, acknowledge, stands to acknowledge traditional teachings and restore cultural stewardship practices. It is a recognition that for centuries, if not longer, many of our traditional knowledge activities have been prohibited by law. And so we're now in an era in time where our nations and our communities are reclaiming and repurposing our knowledge back onto the land and onto the water for stewardship. And we need more of that. And that's what this strategy encourages. Mend stands for mend the shoreline and practice healing for coastal and environmental sovereignty. And it really is focused on this idea of blue carbon ecosystems, mending shores, not necessarily curating them to be beaches for lounging, but curating them and restoring them and helping them to heal so that they can be vibrant ecosystems that thrive on their own. And then protect stands for protect future generations by protecting cultural sites and ancestors, really looking at some of the impacts that sea level rise has to our cultural resources. Unite means to unite with other communities and build capacity and plan for relocation. It's a recognition that we can scale up our resources, that we are stronger together as nations working in collaboration. And move stands to move to new places with cultural connections and rebuild. Historically, we have been mobile people. Human beings are mobile. We're not intended to be stagnant in one place. And so when we're thinking about climate change, when we're thinking about sea level rise, we have to be able to adapt. And oftentimes we're not, because of the colonial systems and structures that we exist within, that have placed us in reserve systems, that have placed us on reservations, that don't allow for that same level of mobility we once had. And so we need new policies and laws to challenge those systems. So ultimately, sea level rise presents really distinct risks for coastal communities, particularly Indigenous communities. And we need to develop new strategies that are indicative of our Indigenous knowledge and science and really build off of local and context-specific practices. And so with that, for you, as you maybe start to think about, well, where can I take this? Well, there are 5 stages to adaptation planning: awareness building, assessments, planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. And there are already really excellent resources available out there outside of the Wampum framework that utilize Indigenous knowledge. And they've done that through talking with elders, talking with knowledge holders. And 2 really great examples that I can give you as I close out my time with you are the Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu prepared by the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. That resource is in the chat for you. And then also the tribalclimatehealth.org through the Tribal Climate Health Project. They have wonderful resources available for the intersection of adapting to climate change through those increased health risks to our communities. So Tabutni, thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and I will turn it back over to the organizers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leonard. We don't want to close out with you. We'd love for you to keep talking all afternoon with us. Thank you for the work that you're doing. It's so important. So now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Deborah McGregor, who's an Anishinaabe from Whitefish River First Nation in Birch Island, Ontario. She joined York University's Osgoode Hall Law faculty in 2015 as a cross appointee with the Faculty of Environmental Studies and Urban Change. Professor McGregor's research has focused on Indigenous knowledge systems and their various applications in diverse contexts, including water and environmental governance, environmental justice, forest policy and management, and sustainable development. She is the Canadian Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice. So I want to welcome you to today's panel. And a reminder, we do have the Q&A at the bottom if you have questions for our speakers, and the webinar is being recorded and will be available after the presentations. Welcome, Dr. McGregor.
Miigwech. So thank you for having me, and I feel honored to be on this panel, and I just want to just acknowledge the work that Kelsey's doing. I will talk about the kind of work that I do, but essentially what she's doing is sort of a lot of the leading edge in terms of where the thinking is going in terms of what Indigenous climate assessments and adaptation that are led by Indigenous people might look like. That hasn't quite made it into, I would say, the major international frameworks that I'll talk a little bit about in my presentation. So I'm going to reflect on a number of things. One is, fortunately, Kelsey covered a lot of like the health implications in terms of climate change, but what I wanted to do is sort of get folks to start thinking about what do we even mean by these concepts. And some of the work that I've done with elders and youth and other knowledge holders, they have very different conceptions about what climate change is and what causes it than let's say what's put out by the IPCC framework. Not that it isn't that, it's just more than that. And also in terms of even how we understand water or even how we understand health. So those, when you're coming from a different worldview, an understanding and experience and knowledge systems, you think about these things a little bit differently. So those are, I've been thinking about those a lot, like how do you decolonize or deconstruct those kind of concepts to make them, I guess, relevant to the Indigenous experience that Kelsey already talked about. I've also been involved in to varying degrees in IPCC assessments, usually, unfortunately, the last minute. We need Indigenous something or other. So I generally, in my experience, haven't had as much time as others to be able to input into these processes. And as Kelsey mentioned, there's already a set of parameters and what I'll just call like biases within that framework of the questions that you need to answer and how you answer them that doesn't really get at a lot of what Kelsey talked about, particularly in her Wampum framework, and why I think Indigenous peoples also need to start to develop their own frameworks on this. So that's what I hope to cover in 15 minutes, and I look forward to engaging with you. So I am going to share my screen, otherwise I will get out of control and keep talking. So it just keeps me on track. So this should work, because I've been teaching via Zoom for many years, 2 years now, I guess. But oh, slideshow, it should go. So I'm hoping everybody can see that. So in my a lot of my work in relation to climate change and traditional knowledge being an area, or Indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, people call this knowledge different things, have always said it's always starting from a place of spirit. So I've been told that a number of times, so I always try to acknowledge that in the work that I do. And again, to try to bring this different perspective that I'm finding in the work that I do, and is a huge challenge in what I'll call the climate change circles I find myself in, to try to advance. And a lot of that has to do with, as we all know and experience, just a profound lack of understanding of Indigenous people and their realities. So we still have this huge burden to try to even communicate that before we can even get into the conversations that we want to have. So hopefully the slides are turning. I've been on presentations before where it turned for me, but nobody else. So hopefully that's what's happening. I did want to start with the view that Indigenous peoples we always had our own knowledge, and we always had our own laws, and we always had our own governance. And as Kelsey pointed out, those have been undermined. But really, for the thousands of years that we've been here as Indigenous peoples, we already had this. And colonization and its impacts are really relatively recent in our history. They've been traumatic, but in our terms of our thousands of years, it's a limited time frame. So we've got all this other knowledge, and we would have dealt with climatic changes in our history. I don't have time to get into it in this presentation, but I do work with our stories, and in the Anishinaabe tradition, for sure, there are stories that I would consider to be climate change stories, with the intention that we would learn how to change and to adapt and to be resilient and to continue to determine our own futures. So to me, that's always important to say. I find in the work that I do, Indigenous peoples often get relegated to populations to study and not really recognized as societies and people that you need to interact with, not as stakeholders and interests. So this still tends to be a problem in the climate change world, in the Canadian context anyway. I'm not comfortable speaking in the United States context, but I have the feeling it's similar. So we had our own systems of knowledge and thought about our ancestors and future generations, and also the spirit world, the non-material world, would have been part of our consideration. So our climate change considerations would be thinking about those as well, not just the here and now in our context. Water. So in the Anishinaabe tradition, we always begin with, here I say Nebe, which is the Anishinaabe word for water. As I'll get into later, we actually have a different construct of what water is. And so again, so even though we're using this word, we actually mean something different. And I'm going to speak to Anishinaabe in particular, because that's what I am, but I do find in the work that I do, it's similar, but obviously reflecting, as Kelsey said, the geography and context that people find themselves. So this is just the image of the recreation story and Sky Woman. And a lot of the work that I do, water is considered to be life. We're mostly made out of water, and concern for water is not new to our community. It's always been important. So this is what is the conventional understanding about what is water. Because I found myself in a lot of conversations, we'd be talking about water, using the word, but meaning something very different. So this is just what you'll find, I guess, sort of like the conventional definition, if you were to look it up, what water is: this colorless, transparent, odorless liquid. But water is much more than that in an Indigenous context. In the Anishinaabe context, Nebe is water from the sky. Water on the land, rivers, lakes, and streams, women's water. So for childbirth, so we're all in our mother's water before we're born. We're water, so in our tears, our sweat, and our blood. So we're part of the concept. It's not separate. This resource, this commodity, this property that exists outside of ourselves is actually part of who we are. And salt waters. And some of the work that I've done around water security or source water protection at the community level, what I learned from communities, again, water we tend to think of as being liquid, but people reminded me that water is also snow, water is also ice. Water takes many different forms. So I always try to acknowledge that as well, that we have a very broad concept and idea, and therefore relationship with water that I found very limiting in what I was asked to do in some of the input that I was asked to do for these assessment reports. So water, soon, I think this weekend, probably my family will be going into the sugar bush to start opening up the sugar camp to start tapping the trees. That's also water, sweet water, and it came at a time to the Anishinaabe when we would have been experiencing major food insecurity, because it would have been very hard to hunt in the bush with the snow you're going through, the snow at that time, the water starting to break up, so you can't really be on the water. So this comes very nutritious water at a time when we actually really need it. So water on law. So as Kelsey pointed out, there's these other processes that impede our ability to be able to adapt and be resilient in the way that we would like. So this is just drawing on the work of Professor May Craft at the University of Ottawa and her work on Anishinaabe legal traditions and water. So again, we understand and treat water very differently because we have a different worldview and understanding of what even we're talking about, and which then is reflected in the kind of relationship that we have. So when it's disrupted through colonization first and then climate change, it impacts us in ways like our own physical bodies, but also our relationship, and then to our ancestors and to the spirit world and future generations. So it's not just a lot of the times what can be measured in terms of the health impacts, it's all these other aspects that are really important to us, and how we have different understanding about what water is. So I just like this image because it speaks to the kind of relationship we have at water is also reciprocal. So water gives life, and a lot of life. Like when people are trying to search in space for life elsewhere, usually they're looking for water. And we also have an obligation to care for water like we would a relative. So those kind of, you don't really see that kind of vocabulary yet in a lot of the climate assessments. Although I'm hoping, I was asked a question this week of, because I was critiquing how the C word, colonization, in a lot of the climate change circles I find myself, people don't like to acknowledge that and don't like to talk about it. And I think in this round of climate assessments, you'll probably find that word as being a factor, actually a rather huge one in terms of the ability to be able to adapt and be resilient and to see a future. So this is just a concept by Edith Walken around water. I'm not going to read it to you, but water kind of has its own thing. Water has its own being and entity. Kelsey talked a little bit about this in terms of the non-human element and the agency of the non-human world. So there's that part of it too. And I found this in some of the work that I was doing with youth and elders, that this idea that the earth, climate change is the earth, for lack of a better word, reacting to what humans are doing to the earth. It's not like what you read in the news. Like, so for example, when the flooding was in British Columbia, and I was in these climate change circles, people thought this is assault by Mother Earth, this is assault by nature. And I'm like, that's actually not what's happening. It's almost like logical that would happen because of the way humans are treating the earth, and the earth has agency. So there becomes this fear around the earth and nature. And in an Indigenous perspective, what you're trying to do is you're trying to connect the idea of climate change and in the Anishinaabe tradition anyway, and some of this is documented through various declarations, is it results because of humans' inappropriate relationship with the earth. Like, we're not living in balance and reciprocity with the earth. We don't know our responsibilities anymore. We don't follow our own laws anymore. So humans have broken their relationship with the earth, and this is what happened, because then you start to do things that you wouldn't do if you understood the earth as being a relation and in reciprocity with the earth. So that means you're going to come up with different kind of solutions, right? And where I'm hoping to get to at the end of this is that, and Kelsey hinted at this, well, she actually developed the framework, is because Indigenous peoples are impacted in distinct ways by climate change in terms of health and in other ways, we have to come up with our own distinct Indigenous solutions and what we understand those to be, as opposed to trying to react to and put lots of energy into other people's ideas of what the solution should be, because that's kind of what we end up spending a lot of time doing. I just wanted to show this image that any entity, like when we're talking about any element, whether it's water, whether it's earth, it's always in relation to other elements in Anishinaabe thinking anyway. So I found in some of the work that I do, it's hard to tell people, no, I only want to know about this, because they always see it in relation to other elements. So I just wanted to point that out here. This many of you already know. There's also a global crisis, as well as crisis in many First Nations in terms of water. And in a lot of these international forums, Indigenous peoples have always struggled to have their voices heard in them. I'm just going to move through this part a little bit quicker because I want to make sure I'm on time. So these are some of the world Indigenous declarations. This is kind of how I know that there's similarities around the world in terms of how Indigenous peoples relate and understand water, and that it's more than what comes out of the tap. It's more than H2O, as commonly understood. There's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples also. So speaking, it's human rights, but it's also Indigenous rights. Human rights on water. I always said, well, I think Indigenous people already knew this. Took a little while for the United Nations to kind of catch up in terms of understanding the human right to water. So in the work that I do around climate change, whatever it is, whether it's health or water or governance, it's important to acknowledge colonialism and its impact. Kelsey did a great job already in her presentation, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but it is relevant in this conversation. Again, as I said, I call it the other C word that makes other people squirm in a lot of the meetings that I'm in. They don't quite get why that's relevant. Because it's not only relevant to Indigenous people, it's also relevant to non-Indigenous people, because either you're going to act in ways that recolonize, or you're going to try to decolonize, right? So everyone's got a role in trying to tackle colonialism. So Kelsey talked a little bit about this already, which is our ability to be able to relate to water in the way that we would like has been impeded by other people's assertions of sovereignty and jurisdiction and authority and laws, and they have not been very good at managing the situation, which is why we end up with the crisis that we're in. We see it as a conflict of legal orders. We have our own laws. We have our own ways of relating. We have our own problem solving approaches. Clearly, the status quo is not working, because as Kelsey pointed out, I call them the disaster reports. These disaster reports come out and things are not looking good. It's actually getting worse. So climate and water assessment. So I'm jumping in now to sort of what I was asked to do on very kind of short notice. And this is where really started to become obvious to me the really implicit biases. So the IPCC process was criticized for not really including or engaging with Indigenous peoples or with traditional knowledge. And so the lead authors who were asked to author different reports were scrambling around trying to find Indigenous people. So sometime in the middle of the summer, I was approached by a scientist to somehow capture in 400 words water impacts, vulnerability, adaptation in a context of Indigenous local traditional knowledge of people in North America, 400 words. And all of this has to be the peer-reviewed literature, ideally within the last 5 years. And ideally in the title, it should say tribal, like in the US context, traditional knowledge should be in there, and climate change. And it was actually really hard to do that. This was a couple of years ago, 2019, I think, when I was asked to do it. All the other contributing authors had way more time to work on their aspects of it. And what I found that there was a lack of literature, because we have to rely on the peer-reviewed literature and for this assessment. And it was because I found that if people didn't ask the right questions, if Indigenous peoples weren't involved in the leadership, climate science leadership, and we didn't get to ask the questions that were important to us, that body of knowledge didn't exist. So people didn't ask the right questions 4 decades ago, 3 decades ago, 10 decades ago, or sorry, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, then we didn't have that existing body of knowledge. And then I thought, this is hugely biased, because if you don't have it, and then, you know, and we have to talk about the level of confidence that we think something is true. And what I found is different worldview and relationships and experience means Indigenous people experience climate change impacts differently and more intensely. And Kelsey talked about that, but you just can't say that. You have to like prove it, even though this is what people are experiencing. These were just some of the where I was able to find some of. I didn't have a lot of space. Indigenous people require water to meet their spiritual needs as well as material needs. Water insecurity impacts health in all kinds of different ways. And climate change related to water is focused morely on impacts to traditional livelihood. So what I found interesting about that I also had to deal with, because a lot of my research is Indigenous knowledge, is I had to deal with other people's idea about what that was. So they think about traditional knowledge in a couple of ways. Like now I remember trying to get this clarification from the scientist, the lead author that I was working with was, do you mean the impact, like the impact of climate change on traditional knowledge, like the intergenerational transfer of Indigenous knowledge, the generation of Indigenous knowledge, or do you mean how Indigenous knowledge informs how we actually do the climate assessments? I couldn't really answer the question because they didn't even know there was a difference. And I went, oh, we have so much work to do in trying to do these kind of assessments properly, because they inform policy and and solutions. But if you're not even naming the problem in the way that kind of makes sense to the people, then it's very hard to generate the knowledge that's necessary to do it. But at the same time, people know this on the ground. They're already experiencing this. There's a lot more to say about that, because that experience has not stopped in terms of being in these kind of places. But what I did do, and it's really heartening, the kind of work that Kelsey is doing, because there's not a lot on this, because I did a major literature review over the summer, because then I was asked to do another one. Yeah, 2 pages to go Canada to US to talk about climate change and Indigenous people. A number of scholars asked to do this again the last minute. And we're like trying to promote the idea that we need to have our own solutions. We need to have our own way of governing impacts, because the way that the climate change world works is it's very siloed. So you do mitigation, you do monitoring, you're doing risk and vulnerability assessment, you're doing adaptation, you're doing resilience, but they haven't really entered into the conversation about talking about Indigenous peoples and governance and how we want to govern, because we are governing. How do we want to govern what's going on in our communities? And then how do we see ourselves moving into the future? How do we enable these spiritually based relationships with water, which relates to our whole way of life? So there wasn't a lot, but I did try to focus on it in this piece. And the report was released a couple of weeks ago, but I haven't been able to find whether, apparently my stuff is in there, because and the word colonization will be there, scandalous as that is, and saying that that's a factor in this work. So we need to be able to decolonize the climate change dialogue, even the dialogue around water. Where do we understand water to be in communities? So Anishinaabe, Inukju'nagawan. So this is just some of MA crafts work. What do these legal frameworks look like? Kelsey's very familiar with this as well. Water is spirit. We don't own water. Water is life. I won't read that to you. But there's another element that comes out of this and work with elders, and that's that there's also a duality to water. That if you don't respect water, if we contaminate water and we pollute water, then water is no longer able to support life because it's contaminated. It can actually harm people, can actually cause death. So this relationship requires a lot of engagement and respect and reciprocity and responsibility. That, like a lot of the essence of Anishinaabe legal traditions is related to what our responsibilities and duties are to the non-human world. So those are my my comments for now, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. And I want to thank Kelsey for setting the stage, and looking forward to the other presentations and learning. So Chimigwech to all of you for listening.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for bringing the spirit of NIBI back into this discussion. It's so important. And again, if folks have any questions for Dr. McGregor, please put them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to those at the end of the next two presentations. So the next presenter is Dr. Shannon Waters, who is Coast Salish and a member of the Métis First Nation on Vancouver Island. She completed the First Nations Family Practice Program at UBC and worked as a family doctor in Duncan, BC. While honored to work close to home, she became frustrated with seeing people mostly when they were unwell and wanted to focus on keeping people healthy in the first place. So she returned to school and completed her specialty training in public health and preventative medicine. Dr. Waters has worked as a director of health surveillance at First Nations and Inuit Health Branch and First Nations Health Authority as the acting senior medical officer for Vancouver Island region. She worked with Vancouver Island Health Authority as a medical director and with the Ministry of Health as the Aboriginal physician advisor. She is currently honored to have come full circle and to be working in her home territory as a local medical health officer with Island Health. Welcome, Dr. Waters.
Hello, good day, Isquail. Can you guys see me and hear me?
We can.
It's been such an honor to be invited to this panel, and I've learned so much from the two fellow women who have presented before me, and I just feel my heart swell as I see so much alignment in the purpose that we bring forward in our work, all in the areas of water and our relationships with water. So yeah, with great honor, I'm here today to talk about Natsumat Kwisyaya Thaka. So this means in my language, Halkamitnam, how we come together as a whole to work together to be stronger as partners for the watershed. Water. So I'm calling into this Zoom today from my home territory, Halkamitnam territory. This is a depiction here of my home territory and outline some of the relationships we have as Halkamitnam people with our home territory. I am situated today calling you from a place called Hlutupnuts. That's where the star is indicated on the map, also known as Maple Bay. And that is one of the places where we have an intimate relationship with water in the form of the ocean. At the left-hand side of the picture here, you can see a blue area, which is Cowichan Lake, which flows as the Cowichan River through our traditional territory down into the Salish Sea. And we've had relationships as Halkamitnam people with this lake, the river, the ocean for generations upon generations. And as Roberta mentioned, I am a member of Métis First Nation, which is one of the 6 communities depicted in the emblems there at the bottom. And I have a lot of family ties to Cowichan tribes as well. So currently I'm working as a physician, as a medical health officer within my home territory. I think the general public has a lot more understanding of public health and medical health officers, given the intense time we've been in over the last number of years with the COVID pandemic. But the aspects of my role really look at working with populations rather than individuals, like I did when I was a family physician. So some of the areas of my work include health protection, which typically includes areas of environmental health and the healthy built environment, disease, injury prevention and control, disaster and emergency management, health promotion, population health assessment, and health and disease surveillance. Now, when typically within the Western construct, which my job is placed within, when looking after populations, the health of populations, that's largely looking at human populations. But as a Halkamitnam woman coming into this work, I look at that as helping to protect the populations of all, including other than humans within my home territory, including the land, the water, the plants, the animals. And therefore, I see watershed protection as a very critical aspect of all these roles I have responsibility in, being a medical health officer in my home territory. In bringing my perspective as a Hul'qumi'num woman, I often, look back to this depiction that was created when I was working at the First Nations Health Authority a number of years ago. And this is just a visual to remind me, and I think about it, almost daily in my work, of how I approach this work to achieving health and wellness for all populations. And in particular, in this conversation, I wanted to just highlight the the yellow circle, which looks at the overarching values that support our health and wellness. Those values being something that both Kelsey and Deb had talked earlier in this webinar around wisdom, respect, responsibility, and relationships. And that we have to uphold those values with our families, our communities, our nations, and our home territories, the land. As a Hul'qumi'num person, we have been working to rekindle, reestablish the relationship that has been so damaged by colonization with our home territory for a number of years through what is called the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group. And in 2005, there was a number of community consultations, talking in and amongst with elders and youth around what do we want to achieve through looking at this process of treaty. And really what was being looked at is that our law-making authority will empower us to be the architects of sustainable futures for our lands. So it was really looking at our relationship with the land, and not that we are not of the land, we are the land. So the sustainable futures for our lands is the sustainable future for all peoples within Hul'qumi'num territory. One of the ways that this has been established, particularly in the context of water, is the now in its 12th year existence of the Cowichan Watershed Board. And I have had the honor, privilege, and challenge of being a member of the Cowichan Watershed Board since 2018. And here is a few years ago picture of the Cowichan Watershed Board, due to the fact that our meetings have been over Zoom during COVID. But here you can see in the front center, previous co-chairs, previous Chief Chip Seymour seated in the front. Next to him, Ian Morrison, who was at the time the chair for the Cowichan Valley Regional District. And at the time that the Cowichan Watershed Board was brought into existence was due to some very severe impacts we were feeling within our region related to climate change. And one of the most severe impacts we're feeling here is that of drought. In the summers leading up to the formation of the Cowichan Watershed Board, 13 to 15 years ago, we had some significant years of drought where the Cowichan River's flow was not at a level that would even allow salmon to still be able to swim upstream. And that was a really painful moment for Hul'qumi'num people, for others living within the community. Our river, which we have been living with, our salmon, who are part of our relationships, form part of our bodies. We've been in relationships for generations on generations. So much was at stake when the river's flow was coming down to what could have been a trickle. And this, drought impact on our region has only amplified since the time that the Cowichan Watershed Board has been in existence. This is a visual depiction of what's happened with drought across BC over our last summer, marked specifically by the heat dome that we experienced in June. And the second and third last columns on the bottom there are looking at West Vancouver Island and East Vancouver Island. So Hul'qumi'num territory being on East Vancouver Island. You can see in June, after the 23rd, when the heat dome hit, we went from level 1 or 2 drought to level 3 or 4 drought. And level 4 drought is one where you have, adverse impacts on people or ecosystems that are very likely. And when we move to the brown area later on in the summer season, which is drought level 5, which we have never experienced before in BC, we created a new category this year to define what was going on. That's where adverse impacts on people or ecosystems are almost certain. And on Vancouver Island over the last summer, we were in drought level 4 or 5 for 72 days. So drought was what brought the Cowichan Watershed Board together, and it continues to be what some of what fuels us in how we deal with this very large impact of climate change within our relationship with water within this area we get to live. And this here is a depiction of the governance of the Cowichan Watershed Board. And I mentioned before that is co-chaired by the Chief of Cowichan Tribes and the Chair of the Cowichan Valley Regional District. And it was very strongly stated at the meeting that both were bringing authority to the table. Cowichan Tribes was bringing their unextinguished rights and title, that authority to the table, and the CVRD was bringing their authority delegated by the province and the Local Government Act. So Cowichan Tribes and the CVRD appoint people to sit at the table. There's provincial appointees, there's federal appointees, and then there's members at large. And I am kind of depicted by the circle in red, one of the members at large that is jointly appointed by both Cowichan Tribes and the Cowichan Valley Regional District. And you can see in the lower half of this diagram, some of the areas where we have technical advisory committees that look at specific areas such as fish and flows, water quality, estuarine and public health, riparian health, outreach and education, and watershed conservation. So in bringing the watershed board together and that collaborative work approach to work that we're looking at, what does this work look like in the last year or so? Just to share briefly some of the things that are being looked at is really fostering that connection with our watershed. So there's been a lot of work with getting people right down into our water, in the river, wading along the shores, the banks of the river, looking at water quality monitoring, doing e-flow development, restoring habitat, assessing our salmon stocks. Within the Cowichan watershed, we have two major watersheds with rivers flowing in between them, one being the Cowichan River, and the Cowichan River, having flow starting from the Cowichan Lake. We have had a weir on that lake since the 1950s. And due to the changes in drought in the summer season since that time, the weir can no longer hold back water that can be released during the summer season to allow the river to keep flowing as a habitat for plants, for salmon, and to help replenish our drinking water sources. So we've been able to get funding from other various sources, including from the Federal Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund, to do some planning to do a new design for the Cowichan Weir. And there's a picture of the final design concept that we're working with right now. And then for our other watershed, the Coxsila watershed, which the Coxsila River runs through, it doesn't have a lake for storage that could be released in the summer with lower flows. It is a snowpack fed river. And so we need to be looking at different methodologies, such as using the Water Sustainability Act to work with the provincial government to create the first water sustainability plan within the province, the Coxsila Water Sustainability Plan. And really, in looking at what the Watershed Board has been able to achieve, particularly because it is co-chaired, there is Indigenous Cowichan principles involved at the level of decision making, is to really bring forward what's been seen across the international landscape, particularly here from this UN report from the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Committee, that shows that nature is declining less rapidly in Indigenous peoples' lands than in other lands, and that governance, including customary institutions and management systems and co-management regimes that involve Indigenous peoples and local communities, can be an effective way to safeguard nature. And why is that? Well, I think very much in line with what the two previous presenters have shared here today, is because we look at water differently as Indigenous peoples. And when we bring co-governance to the table with Indigenous nations in the situation of the Cowichan Watershed Board, sitting with communities, governments, and other diverse sectors, it centers our relationships with watersheds, lands, and environment in all our decision-making. This middle area here in orange is Natsamat Quisyayas Thaka. It is where we come together as a whole to work together to be stronger as partners for the watershed. But this this approach that I am so honored to be part of within the Cowichan Watershed Board work is not reflected everywhere, particularly within, provincial colonial constructs. I, as a medical health officer, work with Western legislation, including the Public Health Act and the Drinking Water Protection Act, which was most recently updated in 2003. And within the Drinking Water Protection Act, water is defined as drinking water that is used or intended to be used for domestic purposes, that is human consumption, food preparation or sanitation, or other household purposes. So it's very human focused and also uses words such as used, like a commodity, not a relationship, a spirit or a relative that we have a relationship with. We are also embarking as here in the province of BC, the government is doing an engagement right now around looking at creating a watershed security strategy and fund. And there was an engagement paper released in January of 2022 that is asking for input on what a watershed security strategy and fund can look like. And within that document, watershed security is defined as the availability of good quality water for healthy ecosystems and communities. And while I acknowledge that ecosystems are listed there, and I'm glad they are, it is still very much a one-sided availability for type approach. And so here is depicted as well, like it's really a one-sided relationship. It's not a reciprocal with responsibility going back to water. It's really, this definition is looking at water and watershed security as something that we might receive as Indigenous communities, governments, or diverse sectors. But really what I wanted to bring forward and what my colleagues here were talking very much about as well, is this is not a one-sided exchange. This is a relationship that needs to be tended, that can be healthy and resilient, and it needs, and in closing that circle and having that relationship, security comes through healthy, resilient relationships with our watersheds. And so, how can we look at, really those concepts, our laws, our values that I spoke before, the wisdom, the responsibility, the relationships, the reciprocity, like that's not depicted in our current legislation, but we have some opportunities right now. The DRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was mentioned earlier, specifically that we have the right to maintain and strengthen our distinctive spiritual relationships with our traditional waters, seas, oceans, lands, and otherwise. And in 2019 here in BC, we had the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which was brought into being, which determines that all legislation within BC needs to be brought into alignment with the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So what I really see that is, in addition to the work happening at the Cowichan Watershed Board, in addition to the support we need to make at many different levels throughout the province, the island, the country, and how do we bring Indigenous peoples to the decision-making with regards to how we have relationships with our water and our watersheds, we now have this additional tool here within the province of BC with the Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act to help close the cycle, to help reciprocate the relationship, where we have the Drinking Water Protection Act currently really just looking at what water can provide to communities, governments, and diverse sectors. We now have DRIPA that we can use as a tool to bring back, to highlight, protect that relationship we have. What can we give back to water? How can we bring these concepts of our laws, our approaches, our values into the provincial context so that we can really seriously start looking at repairing, healing our relationship with water, and thus making critical progress in terms of things we need to do in climate change with regards to its effects on water, to plants, humans, the land, and everything beyond. So with that, I just want to say, Hait Sapka, thank you for allowing me some time to share, and also interested to hear what the other panel member has to share as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Waters, for that wonderful presentation. And we look forward to any questions that come in for you as well. And now we'll turn to our final speaker, Dr. Trevor Bell, who is a university research professor in geography at Memorial University of Newfoundland. He is a champion of issues surrounding climate change and Indigenous peoples in the Arctic, and whose creativity, drive, and concern has had substantial impact on the well-being of Canadians across the North. He has merged natural and social sciences with Indigenous knowledges and expertise to create a multidisciplinary approach to his research on climate variability and change. His most recent partnership, Smart Ice, has transformed into a social enterprise recognized by the United Nations and the Governor General's Innovation Award. In 2021, he received the inaugural Frederick Paulson Arctic Academic Action Award and the Martin Bergman Medal for Excellence for Arctic Leadership for groundbreaking achievements on climate change adaptation. I want to thank you for your work that you're going to be talking about, and welcome to the panel, Dr. Bell.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen here. Thank you for the invitation to share this wonderful panel and to be able to, I guess in a fairly short time, share a little bit of information about Smart Ice, which was builds on my experience and career for over 40 years working on climate change issues with communities as a non-Indigenous research partner. And I really want to acknowledge all of those Indigenous communities in making this presentation. Climate change impacts. Smart Ice began as a response really to communities' concerns about how climate change was impacting their ice and their ice travel. So I want to just tell you a little bit about what Smart Ice is, and then we'll work our way in a very short time just to give you some examples. But as I say, there's lots more other resources that you can access, and also reach out directly to me to find out more about Smart Ice and perhaps Smart Ice in your community. So Smart Ice is a non-profit work integration social enterprise, and I'll explain that context in a second. But essentially what it does is it empowers northern communities to monitor their own ice and to help them to adapt to these changing ice conditions. It essentially puts into their hands the tools and technology they need to be able to adapt to this unpredictable, unprecedented ice conditions. But technology is only part of the solution. And I also want to share later on in the presentation how Indigenous knowledge of safe ice travel is an essential component of climate change solutions and also of the Smart Ice initiative. As many of you will know, especially those in the panel, but also in the audience here today, ice, whether it's freshwater ice on lakes and rivers, or it's sea ice around the coasts of all the Indigenous communities in the north, it's not only a hunting platform, it's not only a travel highway, it's part of Indigenous culture and identity, particularly for Inuit. And of course, that is starting to change dramatically. We're starting to see how the ice season is getting shorter, freeze up is happening later, melt and break up is happening earlier. The ice is getting thinner, it's getting rougher. And we can see the impacts of that on food security, on health, and also on mental health and well-being, because access to land is such an important part of Inuit culture and identity. What I want to do is show you a couple of the technological innovations that we've developed in order to help communities monitor their own ice, particularly ice thickness, which has been identified as a hazard for safe ice travel across many communities. We developed this with particularly two communities, one in Nunatsiavut in Labrador, the community of Nain, and in Mitamatlik or Pond Inlet on the northern coast of Baffin Island in Nunavut. Here on the bottom right of the photograph is what we call a smart buoy, a stationary sea ice thickness sensor that's able to, it's inserted into the ice and it reports back via satellite to the communities the thickness of the ice and the snow using temperature gradients. We also have a mobile sea ice thickness sensor called a smart cometic. A cometic is for an ice sled. And essentially in this video here, you can see an operator towing the sled behind the snowmobile, and it's telling them exactly the thickness of the ice underneath them as they travel. And you can see here in the top right, I've circled the small computer that sits on the handlebars of the snowmobile reporting back 4.8 feet as the thickness of the ice underneath the sled in this particular case. And when the operator returns back to their community, in this example, Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut, it displays the information as a color-coded ice thickness track. So where it's red here, you can see it's less than 1 foot thick, and where it's yellow and orange, maybe 2 or 3 feet thick. But it's able to allow travelers, Inuit hunters and harvesters, to be able to decide when they should travel, where they should travel, what community trails should they travel on. And this information is available on Siku, on the website, and also on smartphones. When we decided to expand these services, when other communities started to ask us, how can we access or share this sort of information and bring this technology to their communities, we had to try and consider what type of service model. And the communities were advising us it's really important to think about Inuit societal values, especially those caring for the environment and the community while being innovative and resourceful. And we, in partnership with communities, settled on a social enterprise approach. And mainly because this type of model maximizes social impact and creates positive community change. That was really important for us to develop that type of service provider, essentially. Later in 2018, we did this, we started in about 2016 after winning the Arctic Inspiration Prize, which helped us to launch the social enterprise. But in 2018, the National Inuit Organization, Inuit Tapiri Kanatami, released a report on National Inuit Strategy on Research. And in this, they identified that research and monitoring can really help reduce the social inequality that exists between Indigenous communities in the north and the south. And partly true, as you can see here, it can be a tool for creating social equity. And also when doing this type of monitoring, it's really important that Inuit are partners in the monitoring efforts. And so this is essentially confirmed for us that social enterprise approach was the right one. I circled here 2 particular action areas of that strategy important for monitoring and research. One is advanced Inuit governance and research, and the other is building capacity. I just wanted to let you know that for Smart Ice, this is a critical foundational principle of ours, that communities manage Smart Ice, the communities where we operate. We establish community management committees made up of sea ice experts, elders, youth, people who can provide us with guidance for how we should be operating in their communities. And that extends, this approach to Inuit self-determination for our enterprise continues into the board level, where currently we're 50% Indigenous and moving towards 100% Indigenous. It also matters for our staff as well, which are 80% Indigenous, and in communities 100% Indigenous. So we train the operators that operate, maintain, and produce our technology in communities. That is really important for us because as they operate, they are integrating their Indigenous knowledge of safe ice travel into the operations as they collect information for the rest of their community. We also basically take a train-the-trainer approach. training Inuit to be the trainers so that we can provide a holistic, culturally contextualized training program for our operators in their own communities, in their own language, which is really important. It's also important that as a social enterprise, we're able to report back on our impact to communities. Since we started 5 years ago, we've expanded from the 2 red dots here, Nain, Nunatsiavut, and Mitamatlik in Northern Baffin Island, to 32 communities across all of Inuit Nunangat and into the Northern Territories. The blue dots here represent communities, First Nations and Métis, where we are doing demonstration projects for smart ice on freshwater ice, lake and river ice. And we're just starting those sorts of demonstration projects because, of course, there's hundreds of First Nations and Métis communities who across the territories and northern provinces, which are isolated, remote, and are connected to the transportation infrastructure with winter roads that are shortening in season. And we're trying to essentially empower those communities to be able to monitor their own winter roads. Part of our reporting back to communities is sort of report cards, and something that's really important for Smart Ice because of the demographic in these communities, where 50 to 60% of the community is under the age of 25, that we focus a lot on Inuit youth, and particularly what we call NEET individuals, not in employment, education, or training. These are young Inuit who have incredible land skills, all sorts of talents and capacity, and we train them to be the operators of our technology. And so you can see here in the left-hand side, we're able to report back that we provide 5,500 hours of employment in Nunavut. We've trained so many operators and youth and engaged so many communities. Another example of that training is our Northern Production Center. So for the first time ever, we launched a technology production center in Inuit Nunangat. So where we train young Inuit to assemble the technology that is then distributed across to all northern communities where we work. So we're training them to assemble the technology, but we're also giving them employment readiness skills so that they can carry on, continue their education, or continue on into other employment paths. So it's a pathway, if you like, to provide these individuals with this unique opportunity, which includes also Indigenous knowledge and being out on the land, as well as the technical and soft skills that are needed. We're also working avidly to keep up with climate change, which is rapidly changing the ice environments in northern communities. So for one example, we're developing new sensors that allows the operators to measure slush, because with increased precipitation in the springtime and thinning ice, there's more flooding of the ice surface, creating more slush, whether on drone or even on salt water or sea ice. We're also starting to develop drone-mounted sensors, which allow the operators to survey the ice from a safe distance without having to travel out on the dangerous ice. So we're building that training capacity to be able to train our operators as drone pilots. I mentioned earlier that Indigenous knowledge is a huge component of how these communities are adapting to unpredictable sea ice. And the elders in the communities that we work with have said to us that they have never written down this knowledge. They've never had the tools to write it down, but they feel that now they need to document it so they can share it with younger generations in their communities. And they've asked us to help them to do that. And so and as they say, that this documentation as knowledge starts with language and starts with the ice terminology. Western science has a dozen or so terms for ice. Many of these communities have more than 100 terms for ice, and that those terms are rich in information beyond just the description of a feature, it talks about the weather, or describes the weather that existed when that particular ice feature formed, how it might melt and break up at the end of the season, whether it's safe or unsafe to travel on. So it's really important that we help document this for the future generations. And just to give you a couple of examples of how they've asked us to share this information. So this information is coming from our community management committees, in this case, Mitimatlik. On the left here, you can see posters that show, in this case, what to know as you travel on the sea ice. So advice that they should be aware of on how to cross leads or cracks in the ice that stay open, and especially ones where there are different levels on either side, and how to be careful. Another one would be how to check the ice with your harpoon. Others about understanding what dark clouds mean on the horizon. It means open water. We've also taken that terminology, which differs from community to community. So these will be produced for individual communities. And we've produced household booklets that we will be distributing to every household in the community that essentially illustrates many of these terms with photographs or with drawings and with definitions in Inuktitut and also in English for some of the younger generations who are not as fluent in Inuktitut as their elders. One other example of this work is the use of the creation of ice travel safety maps. This is my last example, so to give you here. You can see the photograph on the right here shows a large ice-strengthened ship traveling and breaking the sea ice. And here in the foreground, Joey Angatok from Nain traveling on the ice on his skidoo. The Canadian government, through the Canadian Ice Service, is mandated to make sea ice charts, like you see here on the left, for all coastal waters around Canada, but their mandate is to support shipping. And therefore, the description and the contents of their ice charts are to aid how to break the ice with a ship and reflects the physical characteristics. There's nothing there really for Inuit for traveling on the ice, showing them where the ice is safe to travel on. And in fact, they don't make these charts very much in the wintertime because there are no ships there. But of course, that's the season when Inuit are traveling on the ice. So in response to this knowledge gap and also requests from communities, we have started to bring that Indigenous knowledge together with smart ice observations, together with observations of people traveling on the ice. And we're training young Inuit to interpret satellite imagery, just like the Canadian Ice Service workers do down south in Ottawa, but they're doing it using their own knowledge and creating maps for their communities. So these are maps by Inuit for Inuit. And my next slide has Andrew Ariak here, you see standing up on the right-hand side here. He's one of our map makers in Mitimatlik, and he describes what is in his map for, I think it's March 2nd.
Sikumi Kawamatuti Smart Ice Sea Ice Safety Map of Mitimatlik area. This map indicates sea ice conditions of my area for this week. Ice has formed, but there are cautionary areas and areas that are not recommended to travel on. On the map, you'll see Mitimatlik, Sina Flow Edge, Atanaktuk, caution areas, Manila, rough ice, Atanaynoyaktuk, dangerous, and Aukonik, Polonius. These maps are available for my community so they can travel safely on the ice.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. This is really just a sampling of what Smart Ice is working in partnership with communities on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bell. I would invite the other speakers to come on board at this point. And I know that we've actually reached the time limit of our webinar, but we're going to take a few minutes anyways, because I think we need to. Trevor, you spoke a lot about Inuit youth and their participation in the projects that you're working on. We know that youth now, Indigenous youth, are the ones who are going to be confronted with a greater changing climate in their lifetimes than we have. I'd like to take a few minutes just for each of you to comment on what advice or guidance would you have for those youth who may be fearful of climate change, but who also want to engage in the protection of their territories, their waterways. Can you comment on that?
Maybe I'll just comment briefly, but let the others join in. I mean, our experience is a lot of our youth really want to be the bridge between science and the elders and the Indigenous knowledge in their communities. And so to try to share that information two ways, between the science and the elders, and to then, I guess, work with their communities on how to respond to some of those challenges that they're facing.
I guess what I would add to that is in some of the elder youth gatherings that I've facilitated or been part of, and this is where like intergenerational sort of context is, where elders and youth do agree is it's going to be basically our own traditions and knowledge that's going to lead to solutions. And that doesn't mean you're rejecting science, because of course Indigenous people are decision makers and govern, and of course they want the best knowledge available to make the decisions they need to determine their future. And in this, I'm sort of drawing a little bit on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996 that came out. I'm that old, and basically said other people's solutions don't often work out that well for Indigenous people, so we need to come up with our own solutions. And really what's come out of a lot of the work, and I'm probably biased towards traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge because that's the work that I do, is they said, learning your language, knowing your traditions, being on the land. Because when you're doing those things, you're monitoring and you're assessing risk. You're doing all of those kind of things that you need to assess climate change and where a future can be. And as Dr. Waters pointed out, is in those spaces on the planet where Indigenous peoples caretake the lands is where's the highest biodiversity, and it's also where Indigenous languages are spoken. So learning language is also really important as well. So really, I think looking to those traditions and way of life that enabled us to survive genocide, enable us to survive colonization, are what's going to help us move to the future. So it's like, have faith in your own traditions. Like, we know some stuff, we know how to survive, and other people can learn from that. So that would be the message that I would give to youth. Shimigwech for the question.
Thanks both. And I think some additional reflections I might add to that is, really in the context of that report where Deborah McGregor just mentioned, like, Indigenous peoples co-governance was found to be a safeguard for nature. Like a lot of the headlines around that were like, Indigenous sovereignty could help save the planet. And that's not an overstatement. And so I really think in terms of, for myself, like, what supports my mental health, because mental and spiritual health is so often overlooked in the field that I'm in, and how do we really help support that? Like, for us, particularly for our youth, I just often speak to, like, our perspectives, our knowledge, our values are so important right now. Like, we all play such an important role, always, but particularly now, over this next time period, when the implications and the effects of climate change are so important, like, and just really try and bring youth, like, right in front and center to, what the healing of this relationship with our environment looks like, because they have the vitality, the energy, the enthusiasm to really bring to that helps fuel us all in terms of what we need to be healing that relationship.
Thank you so much. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for providing this panel discussion with Indigenous conceptualizations, worldviews, and frameworks around water, and for bringing the spirit of water into this discussion, and how water Nibi keeps us safe and well, but also that we have our own responsibilities and roles and relationships towards water to keep it safe and well as well. So many, many thanks to each of you for taking the time out of your day to give us such wonderful thoughts and how we can go forward and how we can understand what we need to do going forward. So thanks again. And that's all I can say. Thank you. And thank you everybody for participating in the webinar today. We do have some suggested resources that will be as part of the webinar recording that you'll be able to see on the NCCIH website as well. On the next slide, you will be able to see how to join our mailing list. So please do so if you're interested. Thank you again for everybody for participating in the webinar today.